The Danube is the second biggest river in Europe, stretching over 1,770 miles. It's also one of the most international rivers on the planet. It flows through a total of 10 European countries. No doubt, like all rivers in the world, the Danube is a treasure for every country it passes through. Its resources, including the water itself, fish, and transport opportunities, all clearly bring benefits. However, as always, there's a catch. The Danube isn't perfect, so sometimes it floods the countries it flows through. Even more than that, floods here are definitely not a rarity. They happened in 2002, 2005, 2006, 2009, 2010, and 2013. But one of those floods was man-made. People just decided to flood a patch of forest near the river. Deliberately causing a flood might seem odd, but in this case, it was actually a rescue mission. And what exactly they were saving and why they had to flood the forest? We'll figure it out now. So the Danube flows through the territory of 10 European countries. Of course, that may not exactly prove it's a super busy waterway, but around 80 million people live in the Danube basin, so no one should have any doubts that the state of the river has changed a lot compared to what it used to be in the past. Let's start with the most obvious. Hydroelectric power plants, which you can probably find on pretty much every river on the planet. These things are incredibly useful thanks to the electricity they generate just from the river's flow. That is, no fuel needed. There are, let's say, quite a few hydroelectric power plants in the Danube basin. As of 2023, a whole 700 hydropower stations were counted on the Danube and its tributaries. There is a particularly high concentration at the beginning of the river, since that's where the slope is perfect for building dams. As of 2010, the number of dams on the upper Danube along the first 620 miles of the river's main course had reached 59. Simple math tells us that on average, there's a dam almost every 10 miles along this stretch of the waterway. By now, obviously, that number has gone up. Let's take a look at Austria. Around 60% of the electricity the country produces each year comes from hydropower. At the same time, a good part of it is generated along the Danube itself. In Slovakia, things are a bit simpler because hydropower doesn't play as big a role here. Still, there are tons of small hydro plants on the Danube's tributaries right now, each with less than 1 megawatt of capacity. Plus, there's the Gabčíkovo hydropower plant, which makes up 11% of the country's total hydro capacity, and of course, it's on the Danube. The biggest system of hydropower plants and reservoirs along the Danube is located in the 73-mile Đerdap Gorge, where the Iron Gate 1 and 2 dams were built. They're jointly operated by Serbia and Romania. For the former, these power stations provide 37% of all energy used, and for the latter, 27%. So, how do all these hydro facilities affect the Danube? The answer is grim. The impact is critical. What happens when a dam appears on a river? The water flow gets blocked and a reservoir forms. Sure, the water keeps moving downstream. The river's not totally cut off, but for the most part, the outflow slows down. And here, as you've probably already noticed, there are dams pretty much everywhere, on the Danube's main channel and on its tributaries. Because of that, the Danube is facing a lot of issues, but the main concern for researchers is the loss of normally flooded floodplain. Back in the 2000s, the World Wildlife Fund said that over 80% of the original floodplain area along the Danube and its major tributaries had been lost since the early 19th century. The situation isn't any better now because no one's giving up on hydroengineering projects. They bring too many benefits to different countries. The number of them has been steadily increasing year by year. Plus, there are plans for new hydroelectric plants that'll make the floodplain situation of one of Europe's main rivers even worse. Bulgaria and Romania have planned to build hydropower plants on the Danube. Yes, a lot of efforts being made to at least keep everything as it is. Many areas have been designated as protected zones, which are crucial for preserving the diversity of floodplain habitats. However, the floodplain still suffers because the main issues are not being addressed. The Danube floodplain is mostly made up of floodplain forests and wetlands, and with the decreasing water levels, its biodiversity at best gets reduced and at worst completely disappears. And this is despite the fact that the Danube floodplain is called a hotspot for biodiversity by the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The river and its surrounding floodplains are home to about 2,000 plant species and 5,000 animal species. There are boreal species typical of Central and Western Europe, including 473 species of vertebrates, such as 73 fish species, 9 amphibian species, 12 reptile species, and 325 bird species. In addition, about 60% of the world's population of the pygmy cormorant lives here, along with 5% of the Palearctic population of the white pelican and 90% of the world's population of the red-breasted goose. So you get the idea. All of them are at risk because of the hydraulic structures. On top of that, there's the impact of other factors like measures for regulating shipping and flood protection, which also have a serious effect on floodplain forests and wetlands. So something needs to be done. For example, as we talked about in the beginning, flood the forest ourselves. This is what an initiative group of people in Slovakia started doing. The area they began to restore had been drained back in the last century, and the reason for that was the construction of the hydroengineering structures we already mentioned. One of them is the Gabčíkovo hydropower plant. On top of that, there was a need to create the right conditions for timber production. No, all the construction and other work didn't completely deprive the area of water, as happened in many other places. The area still got flooded, but the frequency of this event has significantly decreased, as well as the amount of time the land stays underwater. Because of that, the natural wetland communities just couldn't recover. The characteristic plant species of the area were replaced by trees and shrubs, and invasive plants also showed up, deciding to take over the space once occupied by those that thrived here before. Not only the plants suffered, the Pannonian root vole, also known as a glacial relict, used to be widespread here. Just imagine, it existed for thousands of years after the Ice Age, and then humans came along, subjecting it to the pressures that are harder to cope with than the cold and sparse vegetation. For this species, the key is properly functioning wetlands, which unfortunately are shrinking, and this could eventually lead to complete extinction. The restoration project came just at the right time, because if things had kept going this way, the historically common species here would have faced even bigger problems. First off, as part of the project, 2,130 feet of water channels were dug, through which water was supposed to flow to the chosen area of 148 acres. After that, flood simulations began, which were meant to show how the area would react to human intervention. And it reacted very positively. After the flooding in the area where once thriving wetlands used to be, various birds, nutria, and other mammals started to appear. European tree frogs showed up too. Mosquitoes also appeared, as wetlands are the perfect place for them to lay their larvae. It might seem bad because mosquitoes bite. Yes, they bite people and animals, but the larvae and adult mosquitoes are food for a huge number of species, so the area turned into wetlands became even more attractive to many birds and other animals. Of course, when water came into the selected area through the channels, fish came with it, an important part of the areas that were once full-fledged wetlands. What about invasive plants that have gradually pushed out the native species? Well, as the project participants pointed out, they're still here, but their numbers have started to decrease. At this stage, the project can already be called quite successful because the main thing has been discovered. With the arrival of water, the diversity has increased, invasive plant species have started to be suppressed, and the historically common plants began to return. But that was just the beginning. As part of the project, simulated flooding will continue to be carried out to gather more information and eventually restore the local ecosystem to its original state. By the way, we haven't mentioned that wetlands are not only a hotspot for biodiversity, but also effective carbon sinks. The area they plan to restore to its original state will be able to absorb from 200 to 350 tons of carbon every year. If we convert that to CO2, the restored wetlands will suck up around 1,290 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere annually, which is equivalent to 3,902 flights between Lisbon and London. Sounds pretty great, right? Especially for Europe with its current green goals. Restoration of floodplains is also a way of dealing with nitrates, which are a big concern for the Danube and local countries. There's a lot of agricultural land here, even though they aren't typically associated with any negative impact on the environment. An orchard, for example, is a source of pollution. The thing is, to improve growth, protect from pests, and for many other reasons, agricultural lands are often heavily supplemented with fertilizers. Besides, there are farms that raise animals. They are also pollutants because there's wastewater and waste from cows, pigs, rabbits, and other animals that humans actively breed. So both fertilizers and farm waste contain nitric acid salts, the so-called nitrates. And these very nitrates easily get into the water of the Danube River. As a result, according to data from 2023, nitrogen emissions in the Danube Basin were estimated at about 500,000 tons per year, with 44% of that coming from agriculture. Nitrates themselves aren't evil incarnate. They're in almost every fruit or vegetable. Still, what really matters is how much of them there is, because if the levels go through the roof, there are bad consequences both for people and for animals living in the Danube River. And judging by the numbers, way too much of it ends up in this European waterway. So what's the Danube floodplain got to do with it? It acts like a natural filter that helps keep the nitrates in check. As researchers have found, even though most of the major active floodplains in the Danube basin only flood occasionally, overall they still remove about 33.2 thousand tons of nitrates from the river system every year, thanks to a mix of in-channel processes and soil denitrification. At the same time, restoring floodplains could raise that number to 38,000 tons of nitrates per year, so the project we talked about today might be small, but it's a complex little lifesaver for the Danube basin. The group of enthusiastic people didn't stop at restoring 148 acres of wetlands. They got another useful project for the Danube up their sleeves. Danube's floodplain forests aren't as simple as they might seem at first glance. They're marked by complex and ever-changing cycles of floods and droughts, a mix of different water conditions and high groundwater levels. For this reason, the local biodiversity is just immense. In the floodplain forests by the river, many mammals live, like the Eurasian river otter and beavers. There's a really high bird species density here, including, for example, the endangered black stork. On top of that, the local floodplain forests are home to over 60 species of fish, 109 species of mollusks, and thousands of insect species. In short, these forests are absolutely teeming with life. However, people have focused on maximizing timber and pulp production, which means large-scale logging and stripping off the topsoil. People are planting hybrid poplars and other non-native tree species that can't support the kind of biodiversity found in local forests. It's also really important that local trees have been and still are cut down at the age of 20 to 40, so they never reach maturity, which means there are hardly any old trees around, and that's a problem for animals because, for example, many birds nest specifically in those. There's also almost no deadwood left, and lots of insects and fungi depend on it. And that's just the first problem. These are floodplain forests, which means flooding is really important for them, but as we've already mentioned, it's now seriously limited by dams and other human activity. As a result, only about 5 to 20% of the river's floodplains can still be called forests that resemble what they used to be. The rest is either fragments or just wasteland. The project we're talking about now is aimed exactly at bringing back a small patch of Slavic floodplain forest. It all started in 2020 when the land along the river got 25,000 tree saplings planted, meant to grow right here. In 2021, another 20,000 young plants were added. Altogether, 58,000 trees were planted by people who took the initiative. Yes, the planting area isn't that big. It's not going to seriously impact the overall situation on the Danube. Still, if the project eventually helps bring back even a part of the Danube floodplain forest's old ecosystem and becomes a home for endangered species, that's already something. A sign that the Danube's nature can and should be restored after hundreds of years of damage. Of course, the river is so important for European countries that it's not just small groups getting involved in its recovery, but big organizations too. For example, there's the Living Danube Partnership, which was launched by the World Wildlife Fund, the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River, as well as local national stakeholders, plus the Coca-Cola Foundation's among the participants. They're also very well aware that one of the main goals for the Danube's health is restoring its floodplains with all its forests and wetlands. That said, it's worth noting that in this case, the scale is, of course, way bigger. The large-scale project was started back in 2014, with tasks matching the scale of the initiative, most of which have been completed. By the end of the first phase in 2021, the partnership managed to increase the Danube and its tributaries' capacity by the equivalent of 4,800 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or 3 billion gallons. Just to clarify, we didn't come up with this comparison, the World Wildlife Fund did. And they have another one related to the restoration of wetlands. By 2021, as part of the project, more than 7,422 football fields, or 20 square miles of crucial ecosystems were restored, which, as we've already learned today, are home to many species and act as carbon sinks while also controlling nitrates. The whole restoration process involved many countries, including Bulgaria. There's Persina Island there, which is a concentration of natural wealth, especially because of the pelicans that nest there, once rare all across Europe. The island is rich in freshwater marshes, floodplain forests, and farmland, and is also surrounded by a protective dike that shields it from floods, but unfortunately for nature limits the flow of water. Tearing it down is not an option, so the companies have focused on upgrading the structures and monitoring the water. As the World Wildlife Fund puts it, this is a modern solution. The result's excellent. They claim life is returning to this area, even without any radical solutions. In 2016, the focus of the partnership shifted to the vast swamp of Garla Mare in Romania. Originally, it had been separated from the Danube to farm fish, but it was later proven that this caused the loss of an important water retaining area. Efforts to restore the connection between the area and the river began. The partnership also visited Hungary. On the border between this country and Croatia, there's a backwater called Old Drava. The plants, rare animals, and everything else typical for such areas. All of this is why the backwater is called one of the most beautiful places in the region. However, there's a problem. Due to various factors, the water level here has been dropping in recent years. To protect the area's valuable wildlife and improve the water supply, the partnership built a water retention structure with fish ladders, and there are many such small yet very important projects for the entire Danube and other countries as well. Big successes have been achieved, but the partnership didn't just focus on restoring what can continue to be destroyed, it also took a different direction. People are trying to change the causes that led to negative consequences for the Danube's nature. Thus, the second main focus of the Living Danube Partnership is water resource management. The partnership concluded that the mindset about how the river should be used needs to change. So they went to talks with politicians and business leaders who make important decisions. It seems like this is the best way to solve the problems that are increasingly affecting both the whole Danube River and its separate wetlands and floodplain forests.